My name is Sergeant First Class Elena Vance, and exactly 7 minutes ago, I learned that the people I would have taken a bullet for were planning to sell my soul for a $915,000 payout. I am a 32-year-old combat medic currently stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado, a woman who has stitched together shattered limbs in the back of a jolting Humvee under heavy fire, yet nothing in my decade of service prepared me for the surgical precision of my own sister's betrayal. I was sitting on the edge of my standard-issue twin mattress, the kind with the reinforced blue vinyl cover that squeaks every time you shift your weight, watching the sunset bleed over the jagged peaks of the Cheyenne Mountain through the narrow window of the barracks. My iPhone 15 Pro, encased in a ruggedized OtterBox Defender series that cost me $64 at the PX, sat in my palm like a ticking landmine. My sister Sandra had called to show me my niece Chloe's 8th birthday celebration in the upscale suburbs of Aurora. The video quality was crisp enough for me to see the individual grains of Madagascar vanilla bean in the frosting of the cupcake Sandra was holding, a small domestic ritual that felt worlds away from the sterile metallic smell of CLP gun oil and floor wax that defined my current existence. "Hold on, Greg needs help with the grill," Sandra had chirped, her voice light and airy, the same voice she used when we were children sharing a bedroom in our drafty childhood home. She set the phone face down on the polished colonial white granite countertop of her kitchen, a kitchen I had helped pay for with my hazard pay from 2 tours in Kandahar. She didn't end the call. For the next 7 minutes, the screen was a void of blackness, but the microphone was an unblinking ear, capturing a blueprint of my own social and financial execution with chilling clarity. Greg's voice, thick with the unearned confidence of a man who wears $500 loafers but hasn't paid his own credit card bill in 3 years, rumbled through the speaker. "We commit her to the Highline Recovery Center for PTSD-related instability," he said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. Highline is a private psychiatric facility in Denver that charges $1,600 a day for luxury confinement, a place where people like me are stripped of their agency under the guise of wellness. Greg continued, "While she's locked in for the mandatory evaluation period, we exercise the power of attorney she signed before her last deployment and flipped the Aurora house. $915,000 cash, Elena. It's the only way to kill our debt and keep the Porsche. The Aurora house was my sanctuary, a 3-bedroom craftsman I bought with my life savings and a VA loan, currently valued at nearly $1 million due to the tech boom in the corridor." I listened, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, as Sandra responded without a second of hesitation. "She's a soldier, Greg. She's used to being told where to go. She'll just think she's following orders until the papers are signed and the escrow clears." My grip tightened on my $200 Benchmade Infidel folding knife, the textured aluminum handle biting into my palm until my knuckles turned ghost white. The betrayal tasted like copper and bile. While I was downrange treating shrapnel wounds and losing sleep to the rhythmic thud of mortar fire, they were calculating the market value of my trauma. I looked at my reflection in the darkened phone screen, a woman who had survived the worst the world could throw at her, only to be hunted by her own blood in a suburban kitchen. They saw a broken veteran they could exploit, but they forgot that a medic knows exactly where the most vital arteries are located, and I wasn't about to let them bleed me dry. Loyalty is a heavy debt, and it seemed Sandra and Greg were about to find out exactly what happens when the bill finally comes due for a person who has nothing left to lose but her dignity. For 12 long years, I functioned as nothing more than a human shield for their financial incompetence, a living ATM in a multicam uniform who funneled exactly $1,200 of my combat pay into Sandra's bank account every single month to extinguish her endless cycle of self-inflicted emergencies. While I was stationed in the biting, damp cold of a staging base in Poland, sleeping on a collapsed cot in a humid tent that smelled of diesel exhaust and wet canvas, Greg was cruising through the manicured streets of our hometown in a glacier-white 2023 Audi Q7 that was registered in my name to secure a lower insurance premium he didn't even pay. He didn't just drive my credit score into the dirt. He used my identity as a scaffolding to rack up $48,000 in high-interest personal loans from predatory lenders while I was literally dodging mortar fire and patching up femoral arteries. I lived a life of forced minimalism, wearing my standard-issue Belleville tactical boots until the rugged soles had smoothed out into slick, dangerous rubber that skidded on wet asphalt, all so Sandra could glide into her children's PTA meetings at the private academy in $600 Christian Louboutin Pigalle pumps. They were living in my mother's house on Westview Drive, a sprawling 2,400 square foot sanctuary that I had personally poured $114,000 of my hard-earned life savings into to renovate with quartz countertops and custom walnut cabinetry. They were nothing but high-end parasites dressed in Patagonia Better sweater vests and Lululemon leggings, comfortably convinced that I was too battle-worn and psychologically fractured to notice that they were methodically bleeding me dry like a slow drip for of my own life's work. The disparity was a physical weight in my chest, a pressure more intense than any body armor I had ever strapped on during a 12-hour patrol in the desert. Every time I looked at the bank statements on my phone, seeing the deductions for landscaping and pool maintenance that I never enjoyed, I felt the sharp sting of being the family's designated martyr. They looked at my scars and my 1,000-yard stare and saw a convenient excuse to treat me as a walking liability rather than a sister who had sacrificed her youth to ensure they never knew the cold touch of poverty. They assumed my silence was a symptom of trauma, a quiet submission to the instability they were now trying to use as a legal weapon against me, but in reality, my silence was the focused observation of a soldier gathering intelligence on an enemy position. I remembered the way Sandra had looked at me during my last R&R, her eyes scanning my worn uniform with a mixture of pity and calculated greed, as if she were already measuring me for a hospital gown at Highline. She didn't see the woman who had survived the IED blast in Zabul province. She saw a $915,000 obstacle standing between her and a debt-free life of luxury. The house on Westview Drive wasn't just wood and mortar to me. It was the physical manifestation of my mother's legacy, a legacy they were prepared to dismantle and sell to the highest bidder while I was drugged into compliance in a locked ward. But a shield isn't just for protection. It is also a heavy, blunt instrument capable of breaking anything it strikes. And as I sat there in the silence of the Fort Carson barracks, I realized that my family had mistaken my loyalty for a weakness that would allow them to consume me whole without a fight. Blood might be thicker than water, but it's also much harder to wash off your hands once the betrayal is complete, and I was done being the silent benefactor to people who viewed my survival as a financial inconvenience. The ultimate betrayal peaked exactly 48 hours after that intercepted phone call, a period of time I spent in a cold, tactical trance as I drove my battered 2018 Toyota Tacoma across the state line to confront the ghosts in my own hallway. I arrived at the Westview Drive property unannounced, parking 2 blocks away near a cluster of silver maples to avoid the security cameras, and slipped through the side entrance using the emergency key hidden inside a fake resin rock I had bought for my mother years ago. I stood perfectly still in the lengthening shadows of the recessed hallway, my breathing shallow and controlled as I watched through the narrow inch-wide crack of the mahogany dining room door. Sandra was sitting at the custom walnut table I had personally commissioned for $11,000. Her hand moving with a practiced serpentine grace as she signed my name on a preliminary realtor agreement from Coldwell Banker. She was using the gold-plated Cross Townsend rollerball pen, a $300 graduation gift I had given her as a symbol of her supposed professional integrity, but now it was merely the instrument of my legal erasure. Greg was standing by the sideboard, his face flushed with a triumphant oily glow as he poured a celebratory glass of $85 Veuve Clicquot Yellow Label into one of my mother's vintage crystal flutes. To Morgan's recovery and our new beginning, he toasted with a smirk that made my skin crawl, his voice dripping with a simulated empathy that masked the predatory hunger underneath. They had already begun the desecration of my history, methodically packing my mother's delicate heirloom Haviland Limoges china into cheap double-walled cardboard boxes from a local U-Haul center. The refined, heavy air of the room was thick with the suffocating, woody notes of Sandra's $140 Le Labo Santal 33 perfume, a scent that now smelled like the stench of absolute, unadulterated greed. They looked at the deed to my Aurora house, the physical proof of every sleepless night and every drop of sweat I had expended in the service of my country, like it was a winning Powerball ticket they had snatched from the cold pocket of a dead man. Greg set the bottle down on a coaster and started scrolling through a digital brochure for a luxury development in Scottsdale, already spending the $915,000 that hadn't even cleared escrow yet. Sandra didn't even look guilty. She looked relieved, as if the burden of being a sister was finally being traded for the freedom of a padded bank account and a clean slate. I watched her finger the edge of the legal document, the very paper that would consign me to a locked ward at Highline Recovery Center while they liquidated my life to cover their $48,000 in high-interest debt. The contrast between the warm, golden light of the dining room and the cold, dark fury vibrating in my marrow was a chasm that could never be bridged. They were parasites who had mistaken my quiet resilience for a lack of situational awareness, forgetting that a combat medic is trained to see the hidden bleeding long before the patient even feels the pain. I stood there in the darkness, feeling the weight of my military ID in my pocket and the burning sensation of a decade of wasted loyalty, realizing that the family I had been protecting was the only enemy I had ever truly failed to neutralize. Family is supposed to be the one place where you don't have to watch your six, but as I watched them toast to my incarceration with my own champagne, I understood that blood is just a biological fact, not a bond. They weren't just stealing my house. They were attempting to hijack my reality and turn my sacrifice into a psychiatric symptom. I stayed in the shadows for another minute, letting the image of their smiling faces burn into my memory, an afterimage of betrayal that would serve as my North Star for the retaliation that was about to follow. The shield was gone, and in its place was a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a threat from the inside out, starting with the very foundation of the lies they had built around my name. At exactly 02:45 in the morning, the world was reduced to the cramped, utilitarian interior of my 2022 Chevrolet Silverado 1500 Custom Trail Boss, which I had backed into the deepest, unlit corner of a 7-Eleven parking lot on the outskirts of the city. The ambient hum of the refrigerated display cases inside the store was a distant vibration against the heavy silence of the cab, where the only illumination came from the sickly green glow of the dashboard clock and the occasional sweep of a passing patrol car's headlights. I had a standard yellow legal pad resting against the steering wheel, the kind with the stiff cardboard backing that I used for inventory manifests in the motor pool, and I drew a single, uncompromising vertical line down the center of the top page with a black Fisher space pen. On the left side, I inscribed the heading "Their Moves" in a jagged, precise script, beneath which I listed the tactical realities of their betrayal: rehab, fraud, and theft. On the right side, I wrote two words that carried more weight than any secondary explosive: my moves, followed by the parenthetical objective of total erasure. In that moment of absolute clarity, the last lingering embers of familial sentimentality were extinguished by the cold realization that family is not an unbreakable blood bond but rather a complex contract of mutual respect and shared burden. Sandra and Greg had not just broken that contract. They had set it on fire and used the ashes to toast their own impending prosperity at my expense. I didn't feel the heat of rage because rage is a loud, messy, and undisciplined emotion that leads to mistakes, and I had been trained by the United States Army to operate in the sub-zero environment of calculated necessity. Instead, I felt the rhythmic, icy precision of a pre-mission briefing, the kind where every variable is accounted for and every exit is monitored. I looked at the list on the left, the $48,000 in debt they had anchored to my name, the forged signatures on the Coldwell Banker documents, and the predatory intent to lock me away in the Highline Recovery Center, and I saw them for what they truly were: a high-value target that had compromised my security perimeter. I was no longer the sister who sent $1,200 a month to fix their self-inflicted disasters, and I was no longer the aunt who bought 8-year-old Chloe cupcakes while I lived in a humid tent in Poland. I was a tactical error they had committed out of pure, unadulterated arrogance, an overlooked variable in their quest for a $915,000 payday. The plan for total erasure began to take shape in my mind with the same clarity as a topographical map, involving the immediate freezing of the joint accounts they had bled dry and the systematic revocation of every legal privilege I had ever granted them under the guise of trust. I thought about the white Audi Q7 sitting in their driveway, a $65,000 asset registered in my name that I would reclaim before the sun reached its zenith, and the Westview Drive house that I would strip of their presence like a surgeon debriding a necrotic wound. They had underestimated the woman who had spent a decade stitching together the broken bodies of heroes, thinking my empathy was a weakness they could exploit, but they were about to learn that the same hands that save lives can also meticulously dismantle them when provoked. As I sat there in the dark, the scent of stale coffee and industrial-grade upholstery cleaner filling my lungs, I realized that the woman they were planning to commit to a psychiatric ward was already dead, replaced by a version of me that saw only objectives and obstacles. There was no room for mercy in a mission of survival, and as I clicked my pen shut, the metallic sound echoed through the truck like the chambering of a round, signaling the end of their era of parasitic luxury and the beginning of a reckoning they would never see coming until the floor dropped out from beneath their expensive, stolen feet. The next morning at exactly 9:15, I stepped into the mahogany-clad sanctuary of Samuel Brooks, a Tier 1 real estate litigator whose reputation for scorched-earth legal warfare was well worth his exorbitant hourly rate. The air in his downtown office was heavy with the scent of expensive Connolly leather, old espresso, and the quiet, vibrating energy of high-stakes litigation that could ruin a man's life before lunch. I sat across from him in a chair that likely cost more than my first truck, and I methodically laid out what I had internally dubbed the arsenal on his polished glass desk. First were the 14 crystal-clear audio recordings captured by my iPhone's voice-activated sync, which had documented every word of their conspiracy to commit me to highline and liquidate my assets. Next, I fanned out 22 high-resolution photographs I had taken of the forged signatures on the Coldwell Banker documents, each one a digital nail in the coffin of Sandra's freedom. Finally, I presented the $12,000 forensic audit I had commissioned from an old contact in military intelligence, a document that detailed Greg's secret web of 14 high-interest credit cards and the $48,000 of debt he had surreptitiously anchored to my Social Security number. Samuel Brooks adjusted his titanium-rimmed glasses and his Breitling Navitimer watch, the sunlight reflecting off the intricate dial as he leaned back in his executive chair to scan the summary of my findings. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, the kind of expression a wolf might have right before a hunt, and his voice was a low, resonant baritone that signaled the end of my family's era of impunity. "This isn't just a domestic dispute or a case of sibling rivalry, Morgan. This is a comprehensive, felony-level paper trail that leads directly to a prison cell," he remarked, tapping his Mont Blanc fountain pen against the forensic audit. He looked me straight in the eye with a professional coldness that I deeply respected, adding that they had essentially built their own gallows out of greed and arrogance, and we just needed to provide the final kick to the chair to let the weight of their own actions finish the job. Without saying a word, I reached into my tactical messenger bag and pulled out 5 thick stacks of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills, counting out 50 of them onto his desk with a deliberate rhythmic slap of paper against glass. The $5,000 retainer was a small price to pay for the surgical removal of the parasites who had been living off my trauma and my bank account for over a decade. I felt a strange, detached satisfaction as I watched Brooks sweep the cash into his drawer, knowing that the engine of the American legal system was now officially fueled and pointed directly at the house on Westview Drive. My sister and Greg were currently sitting in my kitchen, probably drinking my $85 champagne and dreaming of their $915,000 payout, completely unaware that the walls of their comfortable, stolen world were already starting to buckle under the pressure of their own fraud. Brooks began outlining the immediate filing of an emergency injunction to freeze the title of the Aurora house and a simultaneous criminal referral for identity theft and forgery that would land on the district attorney's desk by tomorrow morning. I listened with the focused intensity of a soldier receiving a final mission brief, my mind already moving past the legal battle to the moment of impact when the reality of their situation would finally shatter their delusions of grandeur. The contract of family was dead, and as I walked out of that office into the blinding Colorado sun, I knew that for Sandra and Greg, the reckoning wouldn't be a conversation or a plea for forgiveness, but a cold, unrelenting storm of subpoenas and handcuffs that no amount of Patagonia vests or white Audis could protect them from. The trap was set for their self-congratulatory Vegas victory return, a grotesque display of premature celebration that saw them burning through $4,200 on a single weekend at the Bellagio, lounging in a Fountain View suite while they toasted to a house sale they believed was already a done deal. While they were indulging in room service and high-stakes slots on my dime, I was playing a much more disciplined game from the cramped interior of a $110 night Motel 6 on the edge of town, where the air smelled of stale tobacco and industrial-grade lemon cleaner. I spent those 48 hours with my eyes glued to the flickering Ring camera feed on my phone, watching with a detached, predatory patience as the realtor, a woman named Heather who wore a beige Tahari suit and an artificial smile, walked through my sanctuary in Aurora with a high-net-worth cash buyer from Denver. I allowed the charade to continue, purposely staying my hand even as I watched strangers run their hands over my granite countertops and critique the lighting in my primary bedroom, because I needed the momentum of their greed to carry them past the point of no return. I waited with the calculated stillness of a sniper until the buyer's $915,000 was officially moved into a secure, lawyer-monitored escrow account, A financial purgatory that Sandra and Greg could see on paper but could not actually touch without my final legal consent. I became the ghost in the machine, a silent digital architect dismantling their future while they were distracted by the bright lights of the Strip, systematically moving $112,000 of my remaining liquid assets into a private, irrevocable trust that Samuel Brooks had established under a blind LLC. This was a tactical repositioning of my wealth that left them with no legal path to touch a single cent of my hard-earned money, effectively cutting off the oxygen to their parasitic lifestyle while they were still breathing the rarefied air of a luxury casino. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank confirming another transfer, I felt the cold satisfaction of a mission objective being met, a stark contrast to the reckless abandon they were displaying in Nevada. They thought they were the protagonists of a clever heist, casting me as the tragic broken soldier who wouldn't have the mental faculty to notice her life being liquidated for their convenience. But they failed to realize that my training hadn't just taught me how to save lives. It had taught me how to wait for the perfect moment to neutralize a threat. The contrast between my sterile, fluorescent-lit motel room and their opulent suite was the ultimate manifestation of the divide between us, a physical representation of my sacrifice versus their unearned indulgence. As I watched the realtor lock my front door on the camera feed, I knew that the $915,000 sitting in that escrow account was no longer a ticket to their freedom, but the very bait that would snap the jaws of the legal trap Samuel Brooks had prepared. Sandra probably thought she was being merciful by planning to stick me in highline, a way to keep me out of the way while she spent my inheritance, but she had fundamentally misunderstood the woman I had become in the decade we spent apart. I wasn't just a combat medic anymore. I was a creditor with a blood debt, and the interest was about to be compounded by a felony-level paper trail that no amount of sisterly pleading could ever erase. I sat in the dim light of the motel, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and felt the finality of the bridge burning behind me, knowing that when they landed back in Colorado, they wouldn't be returning to a life of luxury, but to a coordinated legal assault that would leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the crushing weight of their own treachery. The formal execution of my counteroffensive took place on a sweltering Tuesday at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a time carefully chosen to ensure the neighbors on Westview Drive were outside to witness the clinical dismantling of a decade of deceit. Sandra and Greg pulled into the driveway in the white Audi Q7, their skin flushed a painful shade of lobster red from the Nevada sun and their clothes smelling of expensive cigarettes and the stale, desperate air of the Bellagio's high-limit slots. They stepped out of the vehicle with the smug, relaxed gait of people who believed they had finally secured their golden parachute, but their expressions of triumph curdled into confusion the moment they reached the front door. They found the heavy oak entrance secured by $300 Schlage code smart bolts I had installed that morning, sleek matte black hardware that refused to acknowledge their biometric data or their outdated keys. I was sitting in a high-backed Adirondack chair on the front porch, dressed in my full Class A Army service uniform, my metals polished to a mirror shine and reflecting the harsh afternoon light like a warning signal. I held a single heavy manila folder across my lap with the steady, practiced composure of a ranking officer delivering a field report, my eyes fixed on them with a coldness that seemed to drop the ambient temperature by 20 degrees. "The house is sold," I stated, my voice coming out as flat and emotionless as a dial tone, stripping away any possibility of a negotiation before they could even open their mouths. Sandra's face contorted into a mask of hysterical outrage as she began to scream about their money and the $915,000 they were owed, her voice cracking as she demanded to know why she couldn't get into her own home. I didn't raise my voice to match her frantic energy. Instead, I simply stood up and handed her the folder, which contained not the life-changing checks she expected, but the comprehensive forensic evidence of her criminal forgery and the 12-page audit of Greg's $48,000 in high-interest debt. I watched the blood drain from her sunburnt face as she flipped through the high-resolution photographs of her own signature on the realtor agreements, her hands beginning to shake with the realization that the paper trail she thought she had hidden was now a public record of her betrayal. I leaned in close enough to smell the cheap gin on Greg's breath and whispered that I hadn't called the local police to deal with a family squabble, but had instead contacted the fraud departments of every bank they had defrauded using my name and credit. I checked my stainless steel Marathon GR watch, noting with a grim satisfaction that their time had officially run out, and informed them that the Audi Q7 was being repossessed in exactly 10 minutes by a recovery team already circling the block. Their elaborate rehab plan to have me committed to Highline for PTSD-related instability had been intercepted and transformed into a formal federal fraud investigation file that was currently being reviewed by the district attorney's office. Greg tried to step toward me, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of masculine bravado, but he stopped when he saw the absolute lack of hesitation in my eyes, the look of a woman who had seen much worse things than a suburban grifter in a Patagonia vest. The $915,000 from the sale was sitting in a trust they would never touch, and the house they had tried to steal was no longer a sanctuary for parasites but a crime scene of their own making. As the tow truck rumbled into the cul-de-sac to reclaim the white Audi, I walked down the porch steps and toward my Silverado, leaving them standing on the sidewalk with nothing but a folder full of their own sins and the crushing weight of a debt they would spend the rest of their lives trying to repay. Family isn't about blood. It's about who has your back when the world goes dark. And as I drove away without looking back, I knew I had finally neutralized the only enemy that ever truly got close enough to hurt me. The silence that followed the arrival of the tow truck was a physical weight, a deafening vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the manicured cul-de-sac as the reality of their collapse finally settled into their marrow. I watched as Greg's face transformed from a smug sun-baked tan to a sickly ashen gray that matched the overcast Colorado sky, his composure fracturing with the same jagged violence as the $200 Ray-Ban aviators he dropped onto the concrete driveway I had paid $4,000 to pave. The lenses shattered against the aggregate surface, a tiny explosion of glass that punctuated the end of his masquerade as a successful man about town. I reached into the manila folder and pulled out the final notarized closing statement, holding it steady so they could see the stamped seal of the private trust that now held the deed to the property they had tried to steal. I informed them in a voice as cold and clinical as a surgical report, that they had exactly 60 minutes to pack 2 suitcases each before the private security team I had hired arrived to escort them off the premises for good. The $915,000 they had salivated over was gone, vanished from their reach like a mirage in the desert, now legally locked inside an irrevocable educational trust for my 8-year-old niece Chloe. I had structured the trust with myself as the sole trustee, ensuring that every cent of that near-$1 million windfall would be spent on her tuition, her books, and her future, rather than on Greg's high-interest credit card debt or Sandra's $600 designer pumps. They had entered this gambit trying to sell my life and my sanity for a quick buck, viewing my years of military service as a financial resource to be harvested, but I had pivoted their own greed against them to buy my niece's security and their own permanent exile from my world. Sandra tried to lunge toward me, her face twisted in a mask of desperation and unearned betrayal, but she stopped short when she saw the 2 uniformed recovery agents stepping out of the repossession truck to hook up her white Audi Q7. The hydraulic whine of the tow lift was the only soundtrack to their ruin, a high-pitched scream of metal that drowned out the pathetic excuses they began to stammer. I stood my ground on the edge of the driveway, the metals on my dress blues clinking softly with every breath, a soldier who had successfully defended her most vital territory from the enemies within her own bloodline. As Greg scrambled to pick up the pieces of his broken glasses and Sandra retreated into the house to shove her stolen luxuries into cheap luggage, I felt a profound sense of closure that no therapy session could ever provide. They had mistaken my loyalty for a blank check and my silence for a symptom of trauma, failing to realize that a combat medic is most dangerous when she is calm and calculating. By the time the hour was up, the driveway was empty, the house was a fortress they no longer owned, and the path to their future was a dead end of legal battles and financial insolvency. Family isn't just about sharing a last name or a set of genes. It is a sacred bond of protection that they had desecrated for a lifestyle they couldn't afford. As I watched their silhouettes move frantically behind the windows of the home I had built, I knew that the moral of this story wasn't about the money or the house, but about the boundaries we draw to survive the people who claim to love us while they hold the knife. I had survived the wars abroad only to find the most treacherous battlefield was in my own living room, but as the sun began to set over Westview Drive, I was the only one left standing with my dignity and my honor intact. I watched through the vibrating glass of my rearview mirror as their entire world shrank into a pathetic tableau of domestic failure, 2 small figures standing on the sun-bleached sidewalk of Westview Drive surrounded by 4 mismatched suitcases that looked absurdly cheap against the backdrop of the neighborhood I had subsidized for them. The heavy steel boom of the repossession truck was already let down, the hydraulic winches screaming as they hooked into the front axle of the Glacier White Audi Q7, a $65,000 lie that was finally being dragged back into the reality of its defaulted payments. Sandra was utterly hysterical, her expensive highlights disheveled as she began clawing at the chest of Greg's navy blue Ralph Lauren polo shirt, her screams muffled by the closed windows of my truck but her desperation written in every jagged movement of her body. They had absolutely nothing left. No deed to a house they never earned, no luxury vehicle to project a status they couldn't maintain, no access to the credit lines they had forged in my name, and most critically, they no longer had their damaged soldier to bankroll their predatory incompetence. I felt the steady, unwavering strength in my right leg. The same limb the military surgeons once said might be too weak for active duty after the shrapnel from a 107mm rocket tore through the muscle in Zabul province. As I firmly pressed the aluminum gas pedal of my Chevrolet Silverado. There was no tremor in my touch, no hesitation in my heart, and no lingering guilt for the people who had viewed my sacrifice as a liquid asset to be traded for a weekend at the Bellagio. I shifted the gears with a mechanical precision that mirrored the cold clarity in my mind. The engine's low-frequency rumble drowned out the ghost of Sandra's voice promising she would take care of me if I just signed the papers for Highline Recovery Center. They had bet everything on the idea that I was too battle-worn to fight a war on the home front, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman I became in the dust and heat of the desert. As I crested the hill and the house on Westview Drive finally vanished from my sight, I realized that I wasn't just driving away from a betrayal. I was driving toward a life where my worth wasn't measured in the monthly installments I could provide to ungrateful parasites. The $915,000 was safe, the legal injunctions were filed, and for the first time in 12 years, the weight on my shoulders wasn't the burden of my family's failures, but the simple, honest gravity of my own freedom. I reached out and adjusted the vents, the cold air hitting my face as I navigated toward the highway, leaving them behind to explain to the neighbors why their lives were being towed away on the back of a flatbed truck. Family is the person who stands in the breach with you, not the person who pushes you into it for a payout. And as the odometer clicked over, I knew that the contract was finally settled in full. The rearview mirror was clear now, reflecting nothing but the open road and the quiet, iron-willed survival of a woman who had finally learned that the most important mission is the one where you save yourself. I moved into my new high-rise apartment in the heart of downtown Denver, a 1,200-square-foot sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass and cold industrial steel that offered a panoramic view of the very skyline Sandra and Greg had hoped to conquer with my stolen wealth. There were no ghosts of my mother's house here, no lingering scent of Lulabo perfume to trigger the adrenaline of a combat veteran, and most importantly, no parasites waiting in the kitchen to count the dollars I earned while bleeding in a foreign land. I sat at my minimalist glass desk, the city lights below shimmering like scattered diamonds, and composed one final clinical email to Sandra that would serve as the definitive border between our lives. I wrote that every cent I had ever given her over the last 12 years was a voluntary gift born of a loyalty she never deserved, but every cent she had tried to take through forgery and deceit was a documented crime that would follow her into her new, impoverished reality. I instructed her never to contact me again for any reason unless it was through the professional, uncompromising filter of Samuel Brooks, whose legal fees would now be her only point of contact with my world. With a single rhythmic click of my mouse, I blocked their phone numbers, their encrypted emails, and their very existence from my digital and physical landscape, feeling the weight of a decade of misplaced responsibility evaporate into the thin mountain air. My peace of mind had effectively cost $915,000, the value of the house I had sacrificed to secure my niece's future and my own liberation, and as I looked out at the Rockies, I knew it was the absolute best bargain of my entire life. I had spent years protecting people who were secretly sharpening knives for my back, but the tactical error they made was forgetting that a soldier who has survived the worst of humanity doesn't break when she is betrayed. She simply recalibrates. I poured myself a glass of water, the ice clinking against the side of a heavy tumbler that I had bought for myself, a simple luxury that wasn't tied to a debt or a lie. The silence of the apartment was a profound, healing frequency, a stark contrast to the chaotic screaming I had left behind on the sidewalk of Westview Drive. I thought about Chloe, whose college tuition was now a mathematical certainty rather than a desperate hope, and I realized that I had used their own greed as the fuel to burn down the bridge they were trying to force me across. They had wanted to categorize me as a broken woman with PTSD-related instability, but in doing so, they provided the exact legal leverage I needed to strip them of their influence and their comfort. Family is not a biological sentence you are forced to serve. It is a contract of mutual respect that must be earned every single day, and since they had breached that contract with such predatory intent, they had forfeited their right to my mercy. As I turned off the lights and watched the moon rise over the peaks of the Front Range, I felt the steady rhythmic pulse of a woman who was finally the sole commander of her own fate. The war was over, the casualties were limited to those who deserved to fall, and for the first time in my 32 years I was truly, undeniably home. Exactly 3 months after the fallout, the intelligence reports from my social circles began to filter in with the cold, satisfying precision of a post-mission damage assessment. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Greg, the man who once toasted his own brilliance with my $85 champagne, was now pulling grueling 10-hour night shifts at a regional Amazon fulfillment center, his soft hands now calloused from moving heavy crates for $22 an hour. Sandra had been forced to retreat into a cramped 400-square-foot studio apartment in one of the roughest, most neglected sectors of Aurora, a place where the air consistently smelled of exhaust and desperation rather than her signature Le Labo perfume. Her formerly curated designer lifestyle, once characterized by $600 pumps and leisurely PTA meetings, had been violently replaced by the bone-deep exhaustion of 60-hour work weeks at a high-volume call center where she was just another voice in a headset. They had spent years underestimating the woman who sent them money from combat zones, operating under the arrogant delusion that they were playing a sophisticated psychological game with a dumb soldier who was too broken to fight back. They had fundamentally forgotten that soldiers are not just trained to follow orders. We are trained to observe, to adapt, and to hold the line with an iron-willed patience until the enemy eventually breaks under the weight of their own tactical errors. Every time I looked at the polished mahogany floors of my downtown high-rise, I felt the profound absence of the stress that had once defined my relationship with my own blood. My life was no longer a resource for them to strip mine, and the $915,000 that would have bought them a new Porsche was now quietly compounding in an account that would ensure Chloe never had to depend on people like them for her survival. I stood on my balcony, watching the distant headlights of the city crawl through the night like a slow-moving river of light, and I realized that the true victory wasn't just in the financial ruin I had visited upon them. The victory was in the silence, the absolute and total erasure of their influence over my psychological well-being. They were now experiencing the reality I had lived for a decade, the long hours, the physical strain, and the constant pressure of survival, but without the honor or the purpose that had sustained me through my deployments. They had tried to pathologize my trauma to steal my legacy, but they ended up becoming the very casualties of the war they started in my dining room. I sipped a cup of dark roast coffee, the steam rising in the cool night air, and felt the absolute stability of a woman who had successfully neutralized every threat to her perimeter. Family is a bond of mutual protection, a shared foxhole in a world that is often hostile, and since they chose to turn their weapons on the person protecting them, they earned every second of the struggle they now faced. As I stepped back inside my quiet, glass-walled sanctuary and locked the door with a single digital click, I knew that the line had been held and the enemy had been broken beyond repair. My name is Elena Vance, and I am no longer a shield for those who do not deserve my protection. I am the architect of my own peace, and the cost of that peace was worth every single cent. I sat on my new private balcony, the cold mountain air of Denver biting at my skin in a way that felt remarkably clean, as I slowly sipped from a crystal tumbler filled with a $240 bottle of Lagavulin 25-year-old single malt scotch. The liquid was smoky and peat-heavy, a sophisticated burn that mirrored the scorched earth policy I had been forced to implement against my own flesh and blood over the last 90 days. Looking out at the jagged snow-capped peaks of the Rockies as they turned a deep indigo under the twilight sky, I realized that while the physical structure of the house I had bled for was gone, the concept of my home was finally, for the first time in my adult life, absolutely safe from intrusion. There were no more frantic phone calls about fictitious utility shutoffs, no more high-interest loans appearing like parasites on my credit report, and no more predatory whispers about my psychological stability echoing through the hallways of a craftsman I had built with my own hands. The 90-degree angles of my new high-rise apartment provided a geometric clarity that my life had lacked for 12 years, serving as a sterile, beautiful barrier between the woman I was becoming and the victim Sandra and Greg had tried to manufacture. I watched a single hawk circle the downtown thermals, its autonomy a silent reflection of my own hard-won independence from the family contract they had so casually set on fire for a $915,000 payout. The transition from the humid tents of Poland and the dust of Kandahar to this glass-walled sanctuary had been a journey paved with the wreckage of misplaced loyalty, but as the scotch warmed my chest, I felt no lingering regret for the debris I had left behind on the sidewalk of Westview Drive. I had spent a decade functioning as a human shield for people who were secretly measuring me for a straitjacket, thinking my silence was a weakness they could exploit until the very moment the legal trap I set snapped shut on their designer lifestyles. They had attempted to sell my life for a quick buck, viewing my service and my trauma as a commodity to be liquidated, but in their blind arrogance, they forgot that a combat medic is most dangerous when she is calm, calculating and holding all the evidence. The $300 smart bolts on my door and the $5,000 retainer I paid Samuel Brooks were the best investments I had ever made, providing a level of security that no military perimeter could ever match because this time, the threat was fully neutralized from the inside out. My niece Chloe now had a future that was mathematically guaranteed by the trust one managed, a legacy protected from the very parents who would have gambled it away on white Autos and Vegas suites. I leaned back in my chair, the heavy glass cold in my hand, and felt the profound rhythmic peace of a woman who had finally learned that blood is merely a biological fact, not a mandate for self-destruction. The war was over, the line had been held, and as the stars began to pierce the darkness over the Front Range, I knew that the cost of my freedom was a bargain at twice the price. I was no longer a soldier following the orders of a toxic family. I was the commander of my own destiny, and for the first time in my life, the silence of the night was not a prelude to an attack, but a testament to my total and absolute victory.